A cocky tourist looking to impress his friends hatches a reckless plan. He's going to snatch a royal guard's bearskin hat and make a run for it. He expects a funny reaction, maybe even a viral video, but what he gets instead, a brutal reality check, because the royal guard isn't here for entertainment. Kyle stood at the gates of Buckingham Palace, staring at the tall, rigid figure of a royal guard standing just beyond the barriers. The famous bearskin hat perched atop the guard's head like a trophy waiting to be claimed. Kyle wasn't like the other tourists. He wasn't here to snap a few photos and move on. He was here to make history. At least, that's what he told himself. To everyone else, he was just another loud-mouthed American tourist with a terrible idea. The birth of the plan. The idea had started as a joke. Kyle and his friends had spent the morning exploring London, drinking at pubs and filming dumb stunts for social media. His latest goal? To get 1 million views on TikTok. As they reached Buckingham Palace, Kyle saw the guards, stiff, motionless, legendary for their discipline. That's when the idea struck him. "Yo, imagine if I grabbed one of those hats and ran off with it." His friends laughed. "Yeah, right," one of them scoffed, shaking his head. "You'd get tackled in 2 seconds." Kyle grinned. "Nah, they don't move, remember? That's their whole thing." One of his friends, still holding a camera, raised an eyebrow. "Dude, don't. That's like insanely illegal." Kyle waved him off. "Illegal? It's a hat. What are they gonna do? Break character?" The group exchanged nervous glances. They all knew Kyle had no filter, no fear, and absolutely no common sense. And now, standing here in front of one of the most disciplined military units in the world, Kyle was about to test their limits. The setup. His friends weren't fully on board, but Kyle didn't care. He could already picture the views rolling in. Step 1. Sneak up behind the guard. Step 2. Snatch the hat. Step 3. Run like hell. Step 4. Upload the video and become a legend. It was flawless. He turned to his friends. "All right, film this." One of them groaned. "Dude, don't do this." But the cameras were already rolling. Kyle adjusted his cheap tourist hoodie, cracked his knuckles, and took a deep breath. Then he stepped forward. The crowd didn't notice at first, still busy taking their own pictures. Kyle kept his steps quiet, inching toward the guard from behind. The bearskin hat was right there, thick, black, and ridiculously oversized. It looked even more ridiculous up close. Kyle grinned. This was going to be too easy. He reached out a hand and made the biggest mistake of his life. Kyle's fingers grazed the fur of the towering bearskin hat. For a split second, he felt a rush of triumph. He was actually doing it. The cameras were rolling, the crowd was oblivious, and the hat was right there, inches from being his. This was going to be legendary. But what happened next would be talked about for years. Before Kyle could fully grasp the hat, something changed. The air around him shifted, like the weight of history itself had just turned its gaze onto him. The crowd, which had been casually chatting and taking photos, suddenly grew silent. Kyle barely had time to process the shift before, thump, a boot slammed against the pavement. Loud, commanding. It was the kind of sound that demanded immediate respect. Kyle's stomach dropped. The royal guard had moved. The soldier, who had stood like an unshakable monument just seconds ago, suddenly came to life. His rifle shifted, his stance widened, and then his voice cut through the air like a thunderclap. "Stand back!" Kyle flinched so hard that he nearly fell over. The booming command hit him like a physical force, sending a shockwave through his chest. The crowd gasped. Phones, once held casually, were now locked onto him, recording his every move. His friends, who had been egging him on, were now frozen in shock. Kyle had seen videos online of tourists messing with the guards before, but this was completely different. This wasn't a staged performance. This wasn't a joke. This was military discipline in action. And now, Kyle was the target. For the first time, Kyle saw the Royal Guard for what he really was. Not a prop, not a tourist attraction. A soldier, a man trained to react, to neutralize threats, to enforce discipline at all costs. And Kyle had just stepped into his world. His chest tightened. The Royal Guard's expression never changed, but there was something in his stance that screamed readiness for action. Kyle had expected a smirk, an eye roll, maybe even a frustrated sigh. Instead, he was staring down a man who looked like he was seconds away from slamming him into the ground. For the first time in his life, Kyle felt real, genuine fear. The crowd had shifted entirely. Where before, they had been spectators to a prank, they were now witnesses to a disaster. People whispered nervously. A woman murmured, "Oh, he's done for." A man shook his head. That guy just made the biggest mistake of his life. Kyle's legs tensed. He had two options. One, run. Two, hope the guard didn't take this further. But before he could decide, the guard moved again. Kyle's body froze. Because this time, first, it wasn't just a warning. Second, it was a response. Kyle had always thought of himself as fearless. He had spent his life pushing boundaries, playing pranks, and getting away with things that would have landed most people in trouble. He had jumped off rooftops into swimming pools, snuck into concerts without a ticket, even faked injuries to get free meals at restaurants. But nothing, not a single one of his past stunts, had prepared him for this. The Royal Guard had moved. And not just a small shift, not an annoyed twitch or a flinch. This was a trained, calculated movement. Fast, forceful, and filled with the kind of authority that made men freeze in their tracks. The moment the guard's boot slammed against the pavement, the air around Kyle changed. The tourist-filled square of Buckingham Palace was no longer just a backdrop for a prank. It had become a battlefield. Kyle wasn't playing a game anymore. He had challenged something far older, far bigger than himself. Centuries of military tradition, discipline, and unbreakable resolve. And now, he was paying for it. The tourists who had been laughing and whispering only seconds ago were now completely silent. No one was moving. No one was talking. Even the constant clicks of phone cameras had stopped. It was as if time itself had slowed down, the entire crowd holding its breath, watching the inevitable disaster unfold in real time. Kyle's mind raced. He hadn't planned for this. He thought the worst that would happen was a scolding from security, or maybe a guard slightly adjusting his stance. But this was something entirely different. This was raw discipline, a response, not a reaction. And Kyle was the intruder. Then the voice came. "Stand back!" The words slammed into Kyle's chest like a battering ram. Deep, commanding, final. It wasn't a request. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order. The kind that made soldiers stop in their tracks, that sent adrenaline surging through trained fighters. It was the voice of someone who had seen real combat, someone who didn't just wear a uniform for show. And Kyle was the fool who had mistaken him for a tourist attraction. His breath caught in his throat, his arms instinctively raised, palms open, as if to say, "I surrender." His body had reacted before his brain could even process it, because somewhere, in the deepest part of his primal instincts, he knew this man was dangerous, and Kyle had provoked him. The guard had fully shifted into his defensive stance now. His rifle, once held in perfect ceremonial stillness, was now angled forward, positioned with absolute precision. Kyle had seen videos of people getting too close to the guards before. He had never seen this. The soldier's boots were planted firmly on the pavement, his shoulders squared, his grip unyielding. This wasn't a threat. This was a warning. A warning that Kyle had seconds to obey, or things would escalate even further. The entire crowd was watching him now. Kyle wasn't the prankster anymore. He wasn't the funny American tourist with a wild idea. He was the idiot who had just tried to mess with a trained military guard and lost. He could hear the murmurs behind him. That guy is so screwed. A few people laughed under their breath, but it wasn't the laughter of amusement. It was the laughter of second-hand embarrassment. Because Kyle wasn't in control anymore. He had lost this battle before it had even started. His legs were locked in place, his breathing shallow and erratic. His hands, once so steady when reaching for the hat, were now trembling slightly. For the first time in his life, Kyle had no idea what to do. Every instinct screamed at him to step back, to apologize, to laugh it off and pretend it was all a joke. But he couldn't. He had spent his whole life being the guy who didn't back down, the guy who pushed boundaries and made people laugh at his stunts. And yet, here, now, in the face of absolute discipline and authority, he had never felt smaller. A smarter man would have retreated immediately, would have raised his hands, stepped away, disappeared into the crowd. But Kyle wasn't a smart man. His pride, the same pride that had fueled his reckless behavior his entire life, held him frozen. For one stupid, fleeting moment, he considered pushing forward. He considered grabbing the hat anyway, just to prove he wasn't afraid, just to prove that he wasn't backing down. But then, the guard moved again, and this time Kyle knew. If he didn't retreat, he wasn't just going to be embarrassed. He was going to be taken down, hard, and in front of the entire world. Kyle's mind screamed at him to move, to step back, to surrender, to do anything but stand there like an idiot, waiting for what came next. But his body wouldn't listen. He had spent his life getting away with things, talking his way out of trouble, laughing off security guards, evading consequences. This time there was no negotiation, no escape. Because the Royal Guard wasn't security. He was a soldier. And Kyle had just challenged him. Thump. The guard took another step forward, his boots hitting the pavement with military precision. The rifle shifted again, his grip still firm, controlled, unwavering. Kyle's pulse skyrocketed. He could feel every single eye on him. The crowd had grown larger, a ring of tourists and locals watching the fool who had just tested centuries of discipline. Some people gasped, others whispered, but no one stepped in. This was his mess, and now he had to face it alone. "Stand back!" The guard's voice boomed like a gunshot. This time it wasn't just a command, it was a final warning. Kyle flinched visibly, his legs shaking slightly. His fake confidence was completely shattered, but the worst was still coming. Kyle took half a step backward, thinking maybe, just maybe, the guard would reset. Maybe if he just pretended to walk away, this whole thing would blow over. But it was too late. The moment he had reached for the hat, the moment he had crossed that invisible line, Kyle had entered the guard's world. And in that world, hesitation wasn't an option. Kyle wasn't moving fast enough. So the guard moved for him. Before Kyle could fully retreat, the Royal Guard executed a movement so fast and precise it looked rehearsed. With a controlled, deliberate motion, the butt of the rifle snapped upward. Not wild, not reckless, but perfectly calculated. Kyle barely saw it coming. A brutal, stunning impact, right to the chest. Not enough to break ribs, not enough to cause serious injury, but enough to make him crumble. His breath vanished instantly, his body losing balance before he even realized what was happening. The world tilted violently, his arms flailing, his knees giving way. And then he hit the ground. Thud. Kyle's back slammed onto the pavement, the breath ripped from his lungs. The impact was humiliatingly loud, echoing off the palace walls, followed immediately by the stunned silence of the crowd. Phones zoomed in, cameras capturing every second. And then, laughter. A wave of hysterical, brutal, unforgiving laughter, not just from a few people, from nearly the entire square. Kyle had been expecting fame, virality, glory. What he got instead was public humiliation on an international scale. The camera crew kept filming, but now it wasn't a victory. It was a disaster, a career-ending, pride-destroying, absolute catastrophe. Kyle's chest burned, his mind reeling as he gasped for air, trying to process what just happened. 1 second, he was in control. The next, he was flat on his back, staring at the sky, while the entire world laughed at him. Kyle slowly, painfully, pushed himself up, his vision still spinning. And that's when he saw the most humiliating part of all. The Royal Guard had already reset. His rifle was back in position. His stance was unchanged. His face was blank, indifferent, unreadable. As if Kyle had never even existed. He had just been physically put down in front of hundreds of people. And yet, to the guard, it wasn't even worth acknowledging. Kyle had just experienced the most humiliating moment of his life. And to the man who had caused it, it didn't even matter. That was the final, crushing blow. And now, there was only one thing left. The walk of shame. And Kyle wasn't ready for it. Kyle's body ached from the impact, his chest still burning from the guard's brutal yet controlled takedown. But nothing, not the fall, not the pain, compared to the humiliation sinking into his bones. The laughter around him was deafening. It wasn't just a few chuckles. It was loud, merciless, and unrelenting. Hundreds of people, tourists, locals, fellow pranksters, had just witnessed his downfall, and they weren't forgetting it any time soon. Kyle scrambled to his feet, his face burning red, his hands instinctively brushing dust off his hoodie as if that would somehow restore his dignity. But it was already too late. The cameras were still rolling. Some people had tears in their eyes from laughing too hard. He heard snippets of conversations cutting through the noise. Dude really thought he could mess with the Royal Guard. Kyle's stomach twisted. This wasn't just a prank gone wrong. This was a public execution of his reputation. And the worst part? His own friends were still filming. Kyle turned to his camera crew, expecting them to be on his side, maybe helping him laugh it off, spinning it into something salvageable. Instead, he saw wide-eyed panic on their faces. One of them, still holding his phone, muttered, "Dude, we need to go, now." Another, shaking his head, whispered, "We are so screwed." Kyle's throat went dry. Even they knew. Even they realized how badly he had messed up. And then, the sound of heavy boots. Kyle's blood turned to ice. 2 Metropolitan Police officers were pushing through the crowd, their faces stone-cold serious. This wasn't a joke anymore. This wasn't just a viral embarrassment. This was about to be an actual arrest. Kyle instinctively raised his hands, trying to backpedal, his voice cracking. Hey, it was just a prank, man. Just a joke." The officer's expression didn't change. "Step aside. Now." As Kyle was pulled away from the square, cameras followed him. People whispered, some still laughing. He dared to look one last time at the Royal Guard. The man who had just wrecked his entire life in 2 seconds. The man who had delivered the most humiliating takedown of Kyle's existence. The man who was still standing in the exact same spot, unmoved, unshaken, completely indifferent. Kyle had thought he was going to take a piece of history. Instead, history had just taken him. And now, as he was led away in disgrace, his entire future as an online prankster destroyed, only one thing was certain. The internet was about to make sure he never lived this down.